Was the Soviet Union an economic success? Absolutely not. We understand, for example, that taxation on food may be completely illegitimate. Government grocery stores in New York City, this is going to be a failure and cost New Yorkers lots of money. This is Steve Gibson reporting, author of Logic's Dictate, a recognition to Tiger Logic for their fantastic production value. Note that Logic's Dictate and Tiger Logic are unaffiliated. It just so happens that my production company that I hired, Tiger Logic, happens to use the word logic in their company name, as I did in my first novel, Logic's Dictate. That having been said, I suspect that their use of logic is not happenstance. Their ability to provide superior production value and customer service is probably centered around the notion that they use logic in their systems and in their management style within which to effectuate a good result. You know, I'm going on about logic and companies in a contextually relevant fashion. Mondani wanting to basically have the government provide grocery stores is counter to good production value. It is illogical. It is against the history of economics that we have learned. Was the Soviet Union an economic success? Absolutely not. Was the Soviet Union effectively a socialist regime and socialist structure? It absolutely was. What did we see in Soviet Union era grocery stores? We saw a lack of inventory. We saw a lack of goods on the shelves. We saw a completely ineffective system to provide goods and services at competitive levels and at levels that satisfied demand. It is and was a fundamental failure, and there is no economist out there that is going, of any moment, that is going to defend that system. Let's take a look right now at Cuba. Cuba is a socialist regime with a socialist approach towards its economy. It is an abject failure. It would be a failure even if there were not boycotts and embargoes on the island. It is simply not an effective way of providing goods and services. The federal government and state governments and even local governments that provide services do not do so in a manner that is market competitive. They simply are not incentivized to provide goods and services effectively and in a manner to meet the highest level of demand. It is a function of human nature. If you are not incentivized to act in a particular way, you are not going to act in that way. You generally speaking, unless it's a charitable organization and there is another mission that's associated with the endeavor, you're not on a sustained level going to rise up every morning, choose to go to work and do better unless there is an incentive to do so. Now, some may maintain that certain religious organizations provide a certain level of service without having market force economics associated with it. I would argue, however, that's exactly the opposite of what we see. What we see, generally speaking, even in religious organizations, they enhance their production value on television. They monetize their structures in a manner to optimize and incentivize the growth of their operations. And this is legendary in terms of the wide array of ministries that exist that basically deploy market-level capitalist techniques in terms of aggrandizing their coffers with respect to donations. They are not shy about asking for donations. They're not in any way, shape, or form minimizing their production values in order to optimize those donations. You cannot identify a single example of a great level of industry on the part of human activity that is not associated with incentives, that is not associated with an attitudinal framework that I'm going to do better because there is a better result associated with it. Now, what will Mondani's grocery stores create? Well, first and foremost, they're not going to be successful. You cannot basically provide free stuff to people and believe that that's going to be a solution to anything. That basically means that you're going to have redistribution of wealth, which is inevitably not going to achieve anything. Let's talk about redistribution of wealth a moment. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about no taxation whatsoever? That's not what we're talking about. Yes, everyone paying a percentage of taxes to support legitimate public goods is something that we have accepted as a good thing. We've accepted that fire departments, police departments, national defense, public education, these types of things are what are called public goods, and having taxes support public goods such as those things, and building expressways, maintaining some level of public transportation. These are all understandable and good things, and they're not competing in the marketplace with other aspects of goods and services that the market delivers. We understand that we need to pay taxes for those types of things. What we don't, however, generally do is have the government come in, redistribute wealth, and replace generally the provision of goods and services, food, shelter, and clothing. We rely successfully on the marketplace to provide the wide array of goods. That doesn't mean we can't use tax policy to incentivize certain behavior. It doesn't mean that we can't use tax policy to provide incentives for certain types of industry. We could provide tax incentives to continue to promote the steel manufacturing industry or the automotive industry. We can minimize taxes for certain economic sectors that we want to promote because we need as a country to compete against other countries that are supporting illegitimately those industries. Does that mean that we completely eliminate market incentivized private company approaches in those industries? Absolutely not. We promote profitability by minimizing regulations and minimizing taxation to support the development of the economies associated with the provision of goods and services in those industries. That's not a redistribution of wealth, that's a minimization of burden to support those industries. It's different, however, if instead of incentivizing grocery stores, the government effectively enters the marketplace to compete against other grocery store providers. A good example of what might be a fabulous policy in New York is to promote the additional construction of supermarkets and grocery stores by, let's say, minimizing property taxes and regulations with respect to those stores, whether it occurs at a state level, a city level, or we have federal level minimization of regulations and tax structures with respect to grocery stores. We understand, for example, that taxation on food may be completely illegitimate. We might want to be able to incentivize taxation structures that promote not only the non-taxation of the operation of the grocery stores, but the construction of these facilities. That is a legitimate government function to incentivize that activity. But what happens if the government enters the marketplace? Well, one, you are then competing against other grocery stores. How is that going to work? Basically, then you are forcing potentially other grocery stores out of business. Well, if that happens, is that going to be more groceries for people or less groceries for people? Does that mean then that the government has to then build out another $30 million worth of grocery stores, increase taxes, reduce tax revenue ultimately, because if you increase taxes, you're driving people out of the city and therefore degrading your tax base? It is a vicious spiral that is clearly unsustainable. Moreover, that assumes that the government-run, the Mondani socialist grocery stores are at some level going to be effective. They're categorically not going to be effective. They're going to negotiate acquisition agreements with other private companies with respect to providing goods and services to people. Are they then going to attempt to control the purchase contracts for goods and services? What's going to prevent then the folks that provide vegetables or other core commodities from merely raising their prices to these grocery stores and therefore drive the margins even more chaotically with respect to Mondani's grocery stores? The fundamental notion here is that Mondani would have to build out hundreds of these stores in order for them to even have a hope of being effective. They would have to enter into acquisition agreements with other private companies that are favorable, which they're never going to do. They're going to basically have to run these grocery stores in a manner that keeps the inventory up, when we all know that from the lessons of history, the shelves are going to run dry, and they're going to drive all of the other private companies out of business, and it will then be a complete disaster. Not only will you have dysfunctional, effectively government-run grocery stores mirroring that which was in the Soviet Union, but then you're going to reduce the supply structures associated with private grocery stores that you have run out of the city. The question I have to Democratic voters and voters in New York City generally: do you not read history? Do you not understand that Mondani is nothing more than a demagogue? That he in his relatively young age has either willfully failed to study history and economics, or he knows darn well the lessons of history and is perpetrating effectively political fraud for his own self-aggrandizement in terms of being a political figure. I don't know which one it is. I would hope that he actually has good intentions and he's just myopic and horribly underinformed or ill-informed. To think that he's effectively perpetrating political fraud is a scary proposition, because he's been able to hoodwink all of those voters in New York City. I guess the bright side, the silver lining here, is that this is going to be a refresher lesson for all of those socialist voters in New York and across the country. When Mondani's grocery stores fail, then we will obviously see a repeat of the lesson that was taught years ago, and maybe it will be more solidified going forward. That is, in fact, potentially the silver lining. I hate to see the people in New York suffer by what's going to happen by the failure of Mondani's grocery stores, but they also are getting what they asked for, and it was their job and mission to be informed, to study history, to have a fundamental understanding of economics. And now I'm going to give them a little bit of slack here, because not everyone has necessarily the time and capacity to study history and economics at the level perhaps it will make them more informed, and that they have been deluded by Mondani with his promises of a better future. So they're going to unfortunately have to learn a very hard and difficult lesson. I am very, very sad that they have to do so, but perhaps they will bravely persevere and learn that and teach that lesson for the rest of the country. Please, again, remember to like, subscribe, and follow. This is Steve Gibson reporting.